So imagine this. You're playing a very difficult retro game. You've made it all the way to a tricky section after 20 minutes of careful gameplay, and then you die. Game over. Now you've got a choice. Do you start the entire level over like players did back in the day? Or do you simply just press a button, rewind time, and pretend the mistake never happened? Thanks to emulators and modern re releases, retro games now come with tools that original players never had. Two of the most common features are save states and rewind, and while they might seem similar on the surface, they actually change the experience of retro gaming in very different ways. So today I want to look at the pros and cons of both systems and ask an interesting question. Do these features help preserve classic games, or do they fundamentally change how they're meant to be played?
Section 1. What are save states?
Let us begin by talking about save states. A save state allows you to freeze an exact moment of gameplay and then load it up again later on. Not at a checkpoint, not at the start of a level, literally any moment you choose. You could save right before a difficult jump, a boss fight, or even mid-air if you really wanted to. For games that were famously difficult, this can completely change the experience. Games like Battletoads, Ninja Gaiden, and Ghosts and Goblins built their reputations on brutal difficulty and limited chances. Back in the day, if you failed a tough section, the game might send you back several minutes, or sometimes the entire level. With save states, however, players can create their own checkpoints anywhere they want. And honestly, that's incredibly convenient. The biggest advantage of save states is player control. You decide when to save. That means you can tailor the difficulty of a game to match your level of patience. If a game is too hard, save more often. If you want a more authentic experience, save less often. Save states also make retro games far more accessible. Not everyone has the time to replay long sections over and over. Modern players often have jobs, school, or other responsibilities, so being able to jump back into a game exactly where you left off can make classic titles that much easier to enjoy. They're also incredibly useful for both content creators and speedrunners. If you're practicing a specific level or boss fight for a video, save states allow you to focus on that exact segment without replaying the entire game every time. So from a convenience standpoint, save states are fantastic. But they also come with a downside. The biggest issue with save states is something that players often refer to as save scumming. Basically, how it works is that you save after every tiny action. Make a jump, save. Open a door, save. Beat a single enemy, save again. At that point, failure becomes almost impossible. And while that might sound nice, it can also remove a huge part of what made retro games satisfying in the first place. Many old school games were carefully designed around checkpoints, limited lives, and the pressure of losing progress. Without that tension, the experience can feel very different. Beating a difficult boss feels amazing when you finally overcome it after multiple attempts. But if you save right before every single attack, the victory might not feel quite as rewarding.
Section 2. What is rewind?
Now let's talk about rewind. Instead of saving and loading, rewind allows you to literally reverse gameplay in real time. Miss a jump? Just hold the rewind button. The game rolls back a few seconds, and you can try again immediately. This feature has become increasingly common in services like Nintendo Switch Online, or compilations like Mega Man Legacy Collection. And in many ways, rewind feels even more seamless than save states. You don't have to manage save slots or remember when you last saved, you just undo mistakes instantly. Rewind is very beginner friendly. Most older games were often designed with the expectation that players would spend hours mastering them, but modern players might just want to experience these classics without the frustration. Rewind keeps the flow of gameplay going. Instead of dying, waiting through a game over screen, and restarting a section, you simply rewind a few seconds and keep playing. It also encourages experimentation. Players can try risky strategies or explore mechanics without worrying about huge penalties for failure. In that sense, Rewind turns retro games into more of a learning experience rather than a punishment. But once again, there's a trade-off. The biggest criticism of Rewind is that it can almost entirely remove a game's difficulty. Instead of adapting to a game's challenges, players might just simply want to rewind every last mistake of theirs. Miss a jump? Rewind. Get hit by an enemy? Rewind. Bad timing? Rewind again. Eventually, mistakes stop feeling meaningful because they're erased immediately. Some players also argue that Rewind feels less authentic than save states. because at least with save states, you still have to make a conscious decision about when to create a checkpoint. Rewind, on the other hand, turns mistakes into something you can erase in real time, and that can dramatically change how the game feels.
Section 3. Bumpy's Verdict.
Now, personally, I actually prefer rewind over save states, and it comes down to one very specific problem that I think a lot of people have run into at least once. With save states, there's always that risk of accidentally putting yourself into a no-win situation. You save at the wrong time, load at the state, and instantly die. Now you're stuck. Unless you've made a backup save, you're basically stuck in a loop where the game is unwinnable. Rewind completely avoids that problem. Instead of committing to a single moment, you always have a buffer of time to fall back on. If something goes wrong, you just roll it back a few seconds and try again. No risk of locking yourself into failure. And honestly, I love that. But there is one pretty big problem with rewind that I don't think gets talked about enough. It starts to get annoying. Like, really annoying. Because if you start becoming overly dependent on rewind, something weird happens. Instead of naturally playing through mistakes and recovering from them, you start interrupting the game every few seconds. Miss a jump? Rewind. Take damage? Rewind. Bad timing? Rewind again. And suddenly you're not flowing through the game anymore. You're constantly stopping, correcting, and replaying tiny moments over and over. At a certain point, that can become its own kind of frustration. In fact, you could argue that excessive rewinding can be more aggravating than playing on original hardware, because at least on that, failure pushes you forward. With overusing rewind, you could end up replaying the same 3 seconds until they're perfect, and that can absolutely kill momentum. It could even create a weird perfectionist loop where you're no longer just trying to beat the game, you're trying to engineer a flawless run. And for me, that can sometimes be more exhausting than simply just taking the death and moving on. So while I prefer rewind overall, I think it works best in moderation. Use it as a safety net, not as a substitute for actually playing the game. I know I sound like a hypocrite when I say that, but believe me, it will eventually create the very frustration that it was meant to remove. So at the end of the day, neither feature is inherently better. Save states give players flexibility and control, while rewind takes away the frustration and keeps the gameplay moving. But both systems raise an interesting question about retro gaming. When we revisit classic games for emulation, are we trying to preserve the original experience, or are we trying to improve it for modern players? Because depending on how you use them, save states and rewind can turn these very difficult classics into something completely different. And maybe that's not a bad thing. After all, the most important part of gaming has always been simple, having fun. But I'm curious what you guys think. Do you prefer using save states, rewind, or neither? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.